everybody. Alex Wiseman here again. I'm here to provide a brief introduction to Leadership for School Reform. This is our week one of our course, and I wanted to give you an overview of some of the major things we're going to be talking about. If we were doing a, all sit down in the same room type of class, this is the discussion we would be having on day one. So I'm excited to get started. So one of the things that I like to do whenever I start a class is I like to start off by sharing a set of terms or definitions for the key concepts that we're talking about. We're talking about three key concepts, as you know, from the syllabus and the course purpose and all the introductions that I've given you. We're looking at the overlap of educational leadership, school reform, and human capital, specifically human capital development. And so we need to know what we're talking about. Now, these are probably terms that you have discussed in other classes already, and so you might have readily available definitions for each of these. If that's the case, I would love for you to let me and the rest of the class know by talking about that in your discussion post for this week. If, however, you do not have one-size-fits-all terms or definitions for these terms, then this might be a really helpful discussion for us. I'm assuming, since you guys this isn't your first rodeo with educational leadership, that you have discussed what the definition of educational leadership might be. If so, I would love to know what the definition is. Now, I know that there are many different types of educational leadership, and there are many different approaches to educational leadership. But if someone asks you, what is educational leadership? I would expect that you would have some sort of an answer for them. It might be situated within your particular context or your community or a particular approach that you use or you have decided that you're interested in, whatever it might be. And it might be different from person to person. That's okay. I'd just like for you to think about what your definition of educational leadership is. Think of it this way: if you had to do the elevator talk, right? You get in the elevator with somebody and you're on the third floor of the College of Education building. You press, floor one, and you're riding down. It's going to take maybe 2 minutes to ride the elevator down if it's really slow. And somebody asks you when you walk into the elevator, what is educational leadership? I hear you're studying that. And you have until the doors open at the bottom to give them the response. What would that be? The same for school reform and the same for human capital. So what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit of time with you going through what are the different ways that you can think about some of these terms. I'm not saying that I'm going to provide you with the end-all, be-all definition of each of these terms. In fact, I'm probably raising more questions than I'm providing definite answers. But hey, that's what grad school is about, right? And you're all professional adults, so you probably have approaches that you've already taken to each of these. So let's start with educational leadership. You may know that there's a history of educational leadership, and there are a couple different terms that have been used over time to talk about what we now call educational leadership. When I was in school, it was called educational administration. And so there are very particular approaches to educational administration. It thinks about the administrative roles that people might hold as a principal or as a curriculum development person or as a superintendent or as a school board member or as a specialist in some area or whatever it might be, working in the district office or working in the central office of the the school or whatever role that administration might play, and then thinking about how you administer education. So it links it much more closely with business and organizational science than it does perhaps with education. Then there was a period where we talked about educational management. And management would be the idea that you're really managing people within an organization. And you're thinking about how you're allocating resources, how you're negotiating relationships with folks. It had more to do with the function of the organization and making sure that it was running as a sort of a well-oiled unit to achieve a particular outcome and managing the different factors that went into that. But now we use the term educational leadership, leadership being the key term. And leadership is interesting because it has a couple of assumptions that go with it. I will tell you right off the bat, you guys know because I gave you probably more introduction of myself than you want, but I do a little bit of work, or have done a little bit of work outside of the country. In particular, one that I didn't mention when I was introducing myself is a fairly strong partnership with the University of Tübingen in Germany. And one of the key things that I've learned out of that partnership, well, one of the many key things I've learned out of that partnership, is that the term educational leadership is not a term that is used very often in German higher education or in German training or even in the professional circles around education in Germany, because the word leader has a German word that is related to der Führer, which obviously brings back some connotations related to Hitler and World War II and other expectations about what leadership is when you're talking about it in the scope of German history. But in the United States and in other countries, when we think about educational leadership, we have a much different perspective. In fact, as I am pointing out up here, using some information from Bush and Uckel, most definitions of leadership reflect the assumption that it involves a social influence process whereby intentional influence is exerted by one person or group over other people or groups to structure the activities and relationships in a group or organization. So social influence, it's intentional influence, it's exerted over people or groups, and the point is to structure the activities and relationships. Now that's interesting, and these are people who are Bush and Uckel are specifically talking about educational leadership in this instance. So we're not talking about with social influence, we're not talking about administration, we're not talking about management, we're definitely talking about the idea of leadership and what leadership means. Larry Cuban has pointed out that leadership, and especially in educational context, refers to people who bend the motivations and actions of others to achieving certain goals. It implies taking initiatives and risks. So again, we've got this idea of bending or pushing or perhaps pressuring, because you can't bend something without a little pressure. The motivations and actions. So not only what people do, but also the reasons why they do it and their inclinations or desires to do it, to achieve certain goals, usually goals that, goals we would hope would benefit the students and the teachers and the larger community. The other idea from Cuban is that there's an initiative component and a risk component. I haven't done this here at Texas Tech, but in my previous institution, I have taught a class called Entrepreneurship in Education and Developing Entrepreneurship in Education for many years. And these are two of the characteristics. In fact, I would just replace initiatives with innovation. If we talk about innovation and risk, then we're really talking about entrepreneurship. So in Cuban's approach, and I'm going to stretch initiatives to be innovation, he's talking in many ways about entrepreneurship. I'm just going to give you the brief version of entrepreneurship there. The central concept, we're back to Bush again, the central concept is influence rather than authority. The idea is that when we talk about leadership, we're talking about influencing rather than taking a position of authority which has a control mechanism to it. So we all know what power relationships look like, and many of you serve in powerful positions, or at least positions that have symbolic power, if not literal power. And so the idea of leadership is that you're using influence rather than authority. You're using power through influence or social influence rather than positional authority. This is what, according to Bush, distinguishes educational leadership from management. Second point is that the process of educational leadership is intentional. In other words, just as we talked about with Cuban's definition, usually the leader, the educational leader, is trying to achieve certain purposes. This means that the leader has an agenda, which is usually geared towards certain goals. Now, whose goals those are and what agenda that is going to vary depending on the context. And as I like to say sometimes, I would like to assume that everyone's agenda and goals are for the best, but sometimes they're not. So we have to think about the process is intentional, in that the person or the group exerting the influence is trying to achieve a particular agenda or goals. And the assumption, the best possible case assumption, is that that agenda or goals is benefiting the larger community. Finally, educational leadership is suggesting that influence can be exercised by groups as well as individuals, and that's what this little cartoon here is trying to get across. This idea of I'm your leader, and then everyone's saying, then you should be over here. This is the idea that you can have distributed leadership and that you can construct leadership teams. That would be a way to approach it. So this gets a little bit more into the methods or approaches or variations that you can have related to educational leadership. So before we move on to school reform, we have a couple of things that we can talk about when we're talking about educational leadership. We can talk about the idea that it has to do more with social influence than positional power or positional authority. That it can be exerted by one person or a group. That it is exerted, in other words, it's a pressure, it's an influence, it's something that's done to bend the motivations and the behaviors or actions of people or groups of people to achieve certain goals, which means that there is an agenda attached to that as well. And it also, we've looked at the fact that we can have individuals as well as groups that are serving in positions of leadership. Now let's talk about school reform for a little bit. As I pointed out in the course purpose statement, these are taken directly from that, and they're both from library. School reform is the intended change of schooling toward accomplishment of a valued goal. So this ties in very nicely with educational leadership when we talked about it was intentional and that it was exerting. School reform is doing exactly that. It's intending, it's intentional, it's exerting force or pressure to change schooling towards some sort of valued goal. We're back to the idea that there is an agenda and there are certain goals that are part of that agenda. So we see, again, a lot of overlap with some of the educational leadership talk that we've just looked at. Library also observes that reasonable people can disagree over the goals of schooling. So this agenda or these goals are not going to be static. So I'm going to say, I'm going to write static, and then I'm going to do a not. Not static. We'll make an X so you know. It varies depending on the context, depending on the culture, depending on the community, depending on the traditional values, depending on the language, depending on the status, depending on lots of things, right? So reasonable people can disagree over the goals of schooling, which means that school reforms are rarely uncontested and rarely universally agreed upon. That means that there's going to be lots of variation in the intended changes and the valued goals that make up school reform. But as I mentioned in some of the introductory videos, and as your syllabus suggests, and as your reading so far suggests, there are going to be certain discourses or a certain type of rhetoric that will align with a particular agenda. I know this is looking messy here. That is going to be a very large part of thinking about school reform. Another way to think about educational reform, and they use the term education reform instead of school reform, comes from the RAND organization. You may have heard of RAND. RAND is a very large organization that largely conducts research and does consulting activities with all sorts of different groups, educational systems and schools being one of the key customers or clients that RAND has. Anyway, RAND says education reform comprises any planned changes, so here we go with intentional again, in the way a school or school system functions. So this is much more about the functioning capabilities of the school. Now, I just said on this last slide that we could have discourse, rhetorics, and agenda that are divorced from actual activity. But RAND is suggesting that it has to have a functional component. This can range from teaching methodologies to administrative processes. So they're taking a much more positive functional approach to school reform than perhaps the other kinds of readings that I'm assigning you for the class. Well, I didn't assign you anything from RAND. If you actually Google school reform and RAND, they have a whole page dedicated to some of the consulting activities and initiatives that they are leading related to reform movements. You might find that interesting.